Close to the centre of the ancient fishing port of Plymouth lies the old church of Stoke Damerel. It stands on the crest of a hill overlooking a narrow valley, and it dates back several hundred years. It lies at the centre of a remarkable story that links the distant past with the immediate present. The story we tell is of an old fisherman who was attacked and robbed close to this church way back in the middle of the 18th century, and how that event has touched the lives of people here and now in the 1990s.
Mirror first. Good. Think about your gears before the bender, and you've got both hands free.
The story revolves around two key figures. One of them is John, a driving instructor. Mid-30s, divorced with 3 children, he now lives on his own. He had no experience of or interest in the paranormal until he was swept up in a stream of events that started last April. Peter is quite different. He is an extraordinary and mysterious figure. He claims not only to be able to communicate with the dead, but to be able to gain from them remarkable insights into the past and even into the future. The story that unfolded tested those claims to the very limit, and we have to say, in no way disproved them. John lives in Molesworth Road, an ordinary street in Plymouth, a row of typical Victorian houses, just down the road from Stoke Damerel Church. Back in the 18th century, this area was open scrubland. Molesworth Road was just a stony track. It seems that traders and carriers, with their cartloads of fish from the harbour, would take a shortcut across the scrubland. This is where John's house now stands. And in some way, the 18th century events seem to have been reactivated within the walls of the house that lies across the old fisherman's track.
Started in about April last year. Presumably I got up for a coffee, or for some reason I got up, walked through the door into the kitchen, and I smelt this fishy smell, and of course carried on, made the coffee, came back. Then the next night it happened again, but it always happened at the same time, about 5 past 5, and then the next night and the next night, and it continued. But the smell of fish was actually smelt not just by myself, but quite a few people who'd come into the flat, by my children who come on a Sunday. And if, let's say, Daniel sat in the front room and he's watching, which he used to watch the wrestling on Sky One, and the other two didn't like it very much, so they used to go into the bedroom and watch a video or something on the other channels.
My brother and sister was watching a video in my dad's room. So then they said, Daniel, come in here. And so I went into the room and they said, we can smell fish. So I could smell it too. And I said, Dad, it's probably like your washing powder. Why don't you change your washing powder?
I changed to a really expensive powder, and of course the smell was still there, so I went back to my cheap powder again, you see.
John asked me to look after his flat whilst he went away for the weekend. He gave me the keys and I went in, had a look around. But as I went in the door, there's very strong, overpowering smell of fish, and it was really bad. And I looked around the flat, nothing appeared to be out of order, everything was okay, and came out again. And I wondered what the smell was, and when I got back I told Yvonne, that's the wife, about the smell.
Smells and odours might seem a totally unlikely hint of underlying paranormal activity. In fact, there is a long and detailed record of their being linked both to some kinds of psychic hallucination as well as to paranormal events. In this case, it seems unlikely to be hallucination, since we have no less than 6 independent witnesses. Professor Archie Roy has no doubts that there can be a powerful link between smells and the paranormal.
It's not just that people see apparitions, it's not just that they sometimes hear voices. Every sense can register, seemingly, phenomena. There have been many cases of people who must be taken to be honest, and who have said that they have suddenly smelt a particular perfume or a noxious smell, and then subsequently it has disappeared. I myself have had a case where there was a very powerful perfume, so heavy, so old-fashioned, that I was sure my clothes would stink of it for hours afterwards. And then the entity, if it was an entity, said, "I must go now, goodbye." And the perfume was cancelled like that.
As far as I'm concerned, smell is just one of the sense modalities, and just as some people see apparitions, other people hear sounds, which, if you like, are not physical, they're auditory hallucinations. Some people have tastes, and some people have smells. And in a way, the smell, the sense of smell, is the most primitive, in the sense that if we go back to earlier life forms, the smell was one of the first ones to be developed. And indeed, when people are falling into unconsciousness or dying, they say that smell is one of the last sense modes to go.
But for John, the sense of something strange going on in his house had become too much. It constantly nagged away at his mind, this same event happening at the same time every evening. Eventually, he summoned up the courage to confide in a friend who had some interest in paranormal events.
John was quite worried or anxious, or about what had been going on. So the only thing that I could think of doing was to contact Peter Bowers, who somebody, acquaintance of mine, because he's more in tune with the spirit world, and I thought that he would be the best person to pick up on what's going on.
He said, "I'm actually coming to Plymouth tonight, to Plimpton." He said, "but I will call round and I'll help you and I'll get rid of this, whatever it is." And he said, "I will be there at 7 o'clock. So, fine, great. Mandy and I sat there, had a coffee, had a chat, trying to discuss about what we think it possibly could be. And about 5 to 7, there's a knock on the front door.
John looked out the window and there was nobody there. Also remembering that at this point the spirit wasn't in the flat with us at that time. So anyway, the knock came again. John thought it was Peter Bowers, but as I said, when he looked out the window, there was nobody there, and the knock came again. And I said, well, of course it could be that the spirit is being invited here by Peter Bowers, so we must let him in.
I said, "Ah, right." I said, "Well, you can answer the door then." So she brushed past me, opened the front door, and as she opened the door, she said, "Come in." Nobody there. It's a bit spooky, if you ask me. As
he walked past me, I could smell the fishy odour that had been associated with him. And it actually went right past me and right past John, who was stood in nearer to the flat door. John and I went into the flat door, closed the door, and I said to this spirit, well, have a seat, make yourself comfortable at home, because my belief is that you treat them, they still think that they're alive, so you have to talk to them as though they are alive.
By this time the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up like you wouldn't believe, And she said, "Sit down in this chair next to me," and the smell of fish was actually surrounding this chair.
A few moments later, Peter arrived. Remember, he had had no warning, no previous connection with John or his story. All he knew about was the strange smell. He claims to have sensed the presence of some alien entity immediately. He went on to describe his contact in extraordinary detail. Age, physical appearance, the robbery, even most unlikely of all, a name.
Now the feeling was that it was a man of about 60, 65, something like that, a small man. He would only come up to here on me, up to my shoulder, rather thick-set, greying hair, but with a very unhappy and miserable expression on his face. He gave me a date of 1759, and he gave me a name of James Goldsworthy, and he told me that he'd been, if you like, an itinerant fish merchant of some description, or peddler, something like that, and he'd had a route of going from the back of the Barbican where he lived, collecting fish and other commodities from various places where they'd be landed, and bringing them up round to the villages at the back of Plymouth, and then he'd go around the circuit during the day and back home again by the evening. And at some point in time he'd been robbed in the vicinity of this place, in the vicinity of this house, and as a result of that it had caused a lot of hurt in his life. He'd been injured and his arm had been broken. His family had left him, his wife had left him at some stage, and all his good misfortune, if you like, flowed from this one instance here, and this is what kept him here. When a soul comes like this to be released, it's necessary for them to be able to make a connection through to the other side of where they need to go, because they're trapped in a lower vibration down here on the earth, and they haven't got the ability themselves to raise themselves into this new situation that they want to be. The reason they're trapped is their sadness or fear or whatever other condition that they've got around them. And so in this case, what I did, standing on the spot that I'm standing on now, I opened a vortex of energy into which he stepped, and it has the same effect as an elevator. And when the energy is right and he's in the right energy field, it's literally just a case of him passing up and going. Now we always say a little prayer, the same as we would for anybody else who was hurt. And this is what happened on this occasion, and he was just lifted from this room, where I'm standing now in the hall, and away. The whole thing would only take 3 or 4 minutes. It doesn't take an enormous amount of time.
This account, for all its graphic detail, leaves us with the eternal problem: what to believe. We have no means of sorting fact from fiction. Peter's story could all be pure fabrication. But in this case, the strange events at John's house that evening were only the starting point. They opened up a remarkable trail that enabled James Goldsworthy, 1759, to make contact with James Goldsworthy, 1996. Immediately after Peter's visit to the house in Molesworth Road, the strange events stopped. But for John, there was an unexpected reaction. Instead of a sense of release, he felt a deep sense of loss, as if a member of the family had passed away.
The night after all this had happened, I was sat in here by myself, and it was about 9-10 o'clock at night. I was watching something like News at 10 on the television, and I felt really sort of as though I'd lost something or somebody, you know, when you lose a member of the family and you get that horrible gut feeling. And I had tears rolling down my face for some reason, and I was crying. I was sat here crying, and I didn't know the reason why. And obviously I knew it had something to do with what had happened, so I rang Peter up and asked him what he thought it was. And he said, of course you're going to feel like this for a couple of days afterwards, because what he'd got rid of has been around for 250 odd years. And at that point I decided that I wanted to really find out a little bit more about who he was or what he was. I started asking Peter some questions, and he just started rattling it off. It was like he was talking to somebody up there.
The owner asked me if I could give him any more information which might help him to trace the man, which I must admit was the furthest thing from my mind at that time. I told him that within the next few days something would happen which would make the whole situation much clearer. I wasn't sure what that would be, only that something was going to happen which would tie in with the name of the man that we'd been given. James Goldsworthy.
Checking your mirror when you're braking.
Only a few days later, the first part of Peter's extraordinary prediction clicked into place. John was giving a driving lesson to a complete stranger, a young man whose name was Jimmy Taylor.
We just finished the driving lesson, and I sat down and did a debrief with him, and he was talking about his stepfather who was taking driving lessons, and I said, oh, send him to me, I'll teach him how to drive, just joking like. And I said, well, if he's your stepdad, who's your real dad? Where's your real dad? And he said, oh, he died. I said, well, what was he called? He said, James Goldsworthy.
And that was where John freaked out and started telling me about another person called James Goldsworthy who's supposed to be haunting his house.
If your dad is James Goldsworthy, then he is James Goldsworthy, and I'm sat in this car next to James Goldsworthy. And I just couldn't believe it.
Both John and James were stunned by this event. They decided then and there to dig into the records of 18th century Plymouth to find out if there'd ever been a James Goldsworthy, and if so, where he'd lived and died, where he'd been buried. They started with 3 mysterious clues Peter had claimed to get from the old Fisherman. They were looking for an ancient church on a hill overlooking water.
He was 60-ish, around that age, and he died in the middle to late 1700s. He said actually he's buried in a church in the fold of a hill near water, but it's not any church. It was built before the 1500s. So I decided to go out to the library and get a book out on churches and historic houses and such like things, and I went right through the whole lot until I actually found 3 churches it could possibly be. One was St Budo, one was Stoke Damerel, and the other was another one up the river, which I can't remember the name of it now, but it's quite a long way off, so we counted that one out really.
The most appropriate church seemed to be that at Stoke Damerel. It was near where the attack had taken place, and where, as it happened, John and James both lived. But there was one major omission. It certainly didn't overlook water. When we began to dig into the records, however, we uncovered an extraordinary and hitherto unknown fact. Back in 1759, it had overlooked water, a tidal creek that ran to the bottom of the hill. It was only filled in about 100 years ago.
This is Molesworth Road. As you can see, at the bottom it meets the waters of Stonehouse Creek. It was perfectly possible for small fishing boats to make their way up to this area at the bottom of Molesworth Road. There are small cottages there that may well have been used as fishermen's cottages. Nowadays, Victoria Park takes the place of Stonehouse Creek. It has been infilled and obviously no longer can be used for fishing.
In Victorian times, when the creek was filled in to become Victoria Park, the road across the park was clearly built on the lines of an older bridge. The fishing cottages are still there, now overlooking the park. So, Stoke Damerel Church fitted Peter's description in every respect. But what would the burial records reveal? This was the key test of Peter's claim. If he was right, they should prove the death of a man called James Goldsworthy sometime after the year of the robbery, 1759. They did.
I'm Paul Bruff, the Senior Archivist at West Devon Record Office, the County Council Archives for Plymouth, and we're responsible for the records of the parish of Stoke Damerel, which is the parish of Devonport. And amongst the burial records that we have, I have a register which includes an entry for the 7th of November 1774, which refers to a burial of one James Goldsworthy.
Even with all this historical verification, at first hearing, this story seems unbelievable, incredible. How is it possible? How does it fit into our view of reality? That a man buried here in 1774 should be able to communicate with a living human being over 200 years later. It's an idea that shatters our everyday frame of reference. But more and more scientists have come to believe that some psychic mediums are tuning in to a communications channel that science doesn't yet understand.
We have a real and important mystery here. There is no doubt that some mediums are seemingly acting as channels between people on this side and what one might call the communicating intelligence, whatever it may be. Information is got through these mediums that they simply could not have obtained in any normal way. What this also means is that the reductionist materialist model of a human being as simply the animal that grew the big brain and that you only get information through the 5 senses and that is all, is embarrassingly inadequate. There are faculties that the human being has that seem to be demonstrated most strongly by the phenomena of mediumship.
Mr. Goldsworthy was trying to make some sort of contact with the James Goldsworthy who is alive now. The reason I'm not sure of, but no doubt the family will be. It's an unusual occurrence, I think, in an instance like this, to get an entity that actually is able to identify itself and give so much information. It isn't normal. But so many strange things happen, and people who I meet often say how strange things happen, how coincidences happen, that this is not really abnormal. There are lots of things happening like this all of the time, but it doesn't sell newspapers, and it's only known by those people who happen to be aware of it at that time.
We can only speculate. Could it be that the ancient James Goldsworthy's purpose in making his presence felt when he did was to ensure the continuation of his name? He needed to contact James Taylor, who had abandoned his father's name. Either way, the message from the past has had a profound effect upon two people in the present.
Now changed my name to James Goldsworthy to carry on my father's name. And with going through what has happened, if the James Goldsworthy could be a past relative, that has encouraged me to change my name to Goldsworthy.
Before this experience happened to me, I was not very spiritual, or I believed in God. Obviously, I think most people do. I didn't go to church. I wasn't into talking to dead people, if you want to put it that way, until after the event. And now that this has all happened, and things have actually been proven to me, where somebody can come into my house and say, there's a guy walked through your house, his name's James Goldsworthy, and he's buried in a church down the road, from 250 years ago, or as close as. I mean, how does that guy know this James Goldsworthy? Where did he pick him up from? And the proof is obviously in the records that this James Goldsworthy has been found, and to me that is just fantastic. I mean, I'm not here on television to try to prove to people that there is something on the other side. I'm just here to tell you that it's been proven to me, and now my faith has been made so much stronger about the possibility that there is life after death.